We're beginning this week the book of Bemidbar and Parashat Bemidbar. Parashat Bemidbar is a very long Parashat. It's 159 psukim, together with Parashat Nasa, which is very similar, which is also 160, 170 psukim. So sometimes people get a little bit distracted during Kriyat Torah. The Parashat, this week's Parashat, consists mostly of census. 2 censai. Twice counting all of Bnei Israel. 2 more times referring or counting the Leviim, plus assorted other counts of the Bechorim, and a Parsha which lists the names of the children of Moshe and Aaron, specifically of Aaron. Parsha has a lot of names and a lot of numbers. The question is really, what's the point? The way to count people in this Parsha is Se'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael le'mishpachotam le'beit avotam. The mispar shemot kol zachar legugolotam. The count is laseit rosh. Literally, that means to raise the head. Parashat Laso is called Parashat Laso for that very reason. Later on, when it gets to the details, so the word that's used is pekod and pekudotam, which simply means their numbers, their effects, their ciphers. But the command to Moshe Rabbeinu is called Se'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael, to lift up their heads. Rashi, the very first verse of the Parsha, comments without explaining what the question that he's answering is. Mitoch hibatam lefanav moneh otam kol sha'ah. The reason why there is a count in this Parsha, and it's not the first time, every now and then, it's only the second year since they left Mitzrayim, every now and then, God counts the Jews, mitoch hibatam lefanav, because they are dear, because they are beloved to him. That's why he counts them. Kol sha'ah, every hour, means very often. When they left Mitzrayim, there's a number there. There's no accounting, but God must have counted them. It says how many Jews left Mitzrayim? Shishim ribo, 600,000. Kishenaflu ba'egel mina'am leida hanotarim. They were counted after many were killed in the Parsha of Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, so therefore he counted them to show you how many were left. Which is now the beginning of the making of the encampment, the Machaneh Yisrael and the Mishkan, and the Chanukat of the Mishkan. So he's Lashrot Shchinato Alehem. God is going to dwell in their midst as Mina'am. B'chad min Nisan hukam Mishkan u'b'chad b'iyah Mina'am. This is very not so clear from the Psukim, but Rashi has a cheshbon that the Mishkan was completed on Echad B'Nisan, and here it says B'Echad HaChodesh HaSheni. So 1 month later, they're setting up now the Machanot, where each tribe is around the Mishkan, Mina'am. It's a very nice Rashi. He says God counts the Jews because he loves them, and every now and then he counts them again, even if there isn't much of a difference. No particular reason to assume in the last year, or the months since the 9 months since the Pasha of the Egel, there's a big difference in their numbers, but God counts them because they're beloved. One might claim, I think it makes a lot of sense, that the cause of Rashi's comment was the fact that they're counted basically twice. The beginning of the Pasha is to count all of the Jews, and it's true that there is a number given for each tribe, but the conclusion is that there are Vayiyu kol pikudei bnei Yisrael beit avotam ben 20 ומעלה כל יצא צבא בישראל ויקחו פיקודיהם 600,000 ו3,550. It says to count all the Jews. You count all the Jews, and you get to the number of 600,000, 3,550. Right afterwards, they're basically counted again by tribes and by divisions. 3 tribes to a division, to the 4 corners of the Machaneh, and that is specifically for a reason. They're creating an encampment that has a particular structure around the Mishkan. So you have to know how many people will be in each corner. There are 3 tribes here, 3 tribes there, 3 tribes there. It's true they don't turn out to be exactly the same number in each encampment, but nonetheless, there's some connection between you counting people because you're giving out their homes, you're giving their tents. In the case of the desert, and so that counting, the numbers that are there have a specific purpose. And I think Rashi is asking them why were they counted without mentioning that purpose in the beginning of the Parsha? And the answer is because they weren't counted for a purpose. They were counted because God wanted to count them, mitoch chibatan. In other words, we see that there are two different reasons why you would count somebody. And the reasons are, I think, contradictory or opposed, diametrically opposed. One is when you count the populace, you're basically eliminating their individuality. You need to know what the mass is. You have to know that there are 600,000 people. You have to know that there are 150,000 people to put into this quarter, 150,000 people to put into that quarter. You don't really care who you're putting where. It's divided up by tribes, that's true, but the very act of counting is to submerge the single individual into a mass, to turn them into a mass. To a certain extent, you could say that was what took place when they left Mitzrayim, where the whole Parashat doesn't exist there. We know that God counted, but there's no counting. There's nobody, Moshe Rabbeinu, Aaron, nobody sits and counts them. Who left Mitzrayim? It was a horde of disorganized slaves fleeing for their lives. They weren't Am Yisrael. They weren't people. They weren't unified. They fled. They were being, on one hand, exiled. They were being thrown out by Paro. On the other hand, they were being led out by Moshe Rabbeinu. Disorganized. They came to the sea. This organization became very, very apparent. The famous Medrash that says there were different groups. Some wanted to go back. Some wanted to jump into the water. Some wanted to commit suicide. They have no leader, and there's no unity between them. And there's a great task to merge them into a people, merge them into a coherent whole. So there, frankly, the only thing it says in the pasuk is that there were 600,000 people. They're being merged together, more or less successfully. It'll take many years before they actually become a truly unified people. So I suspect that Rashi is trying to say that, okay, that's one purpose for a census, but if there are two censi here, the first one is for a different reason, and the reason is the opposite. Mishum chibatan moneh otam kol sha'ah. When you count something because you love it, when you count something because mitoch chibatan, then each count, the 1, 2, 3, is signifying, is distinguishing from the mass. You look at a room full of people. It could be anywhere between 50 and 100 people there. If you start counting them one by one, you're separating each one from the mass. And that's what I think the meaning of the words Se'u et rosh kol adat b'nei Yisrael. The colloquialism used by the Torah to have a census says you're not just figuring out how big the unified mass is. You're separating, you're raising the head. The head, of course, is the most significant part of the person. It's where his individuality is found, his personality, his what's called b'lashon Chazal, hadeot shelo. The word deot we think means your ideas, but in Hebrew it means your personality, your midot, your character traits. This laseit rosh is to raise the individuality of the person. Rashi says, that's mishum chibatan. Because it's not for a purpose. It's not so there will be a better army later on. There'll be a better, a more organized community, a more organized encampment. It's to each person should stand by himself before God as an individual. What this question really raises is, I think, a very essential question within the Torah itself. As we all remember, in Parashat Ki Tisa, where it also uses the same verb, Ki Tisa Rosh Bnei Yisrael. So there the Torah indicates it's extremely dangerous to count people. And the Torah says that it doesn't mention in the beginning of the Pasha that it's for the purpose of raising money. It's the other way around. Ki tisad rosh b'nei Yisrael. You should take a half shekel from each person below yeh bahem negef, from which it seems apparent, and Chazal derive, that the act of counting the Jewish people is literally dangerous. It can cause a negef, it can cause a disease, it can cause a corona, it can cause a magefa. And the giving of the chatzi shekel is lechaper al nafshotehem. Later on, there's a pasha in Sefer Shmuel when David HaMelech orders a census, and sure enough, what takes place immediately afterwards is a negef, is a epidemic, and David HaMelech has to do something and accepts responsibility in order to save Bnei Yisrael. So counting is dangerous. Why is counting dangerous? There are a number of different explanations given by different Mepharshim. The one that always appealed to me the most, if I remember correctly, it's found in the Orchaim in Kitisa, but I might be mixed up here. The explanation is that when you count people, you distinguish them. Each one then has to stand on his own. It's very dangerous to stand on your own before God. Because if you stand on your own before God, then you're judged on who you are. You're judged on the number of mitzvot that you've done, the zchuyot, the merits that you've achieved, and also on the demerits, also on the things that you've missed, all the sins that you've done. And who can be so certain that he will come out of that trial, that standing before God all by oneself, without anyone's support, without being part of anything greater than oneself? It's extremely dangerous. You will be judged, and it's a good chance. Chances are you will be judged negatively, because who could stand before God and claim, I'm a tzaddik? Ein adam tzaddik b'arz sheyachta. When we appear before God within the context of Klal Yisrael, then there is the brit, there's the covenant that God did with Yisrael. There's the point that the Ran in the Rashot Haran, the Rashav Vav, says that whenever we come together with each other, so the merits of each person cancel out the demerits of the next. In other words, everybody has some good things. I was very good in this mitzvah, but I didn't do the other mitzvah, but you did the other mitzvah. So we're taken all together, we appear to be tzaddikim. The mass is a tzaddik, even if the individuals are not. There are all sorts of reasons why a Jew would want to disappear, to be merged into the mass, so as not to have to stand alone, naked, unadorned before God. Pasha, which is very, very striking, in Sefer Melachim, when Elisha wishes to reward the woman who provided for him, who gave him a bed to sleep in and food, and he sends for her and says, I can speak to the king for you. Do you have any problems? I can arrange a benefit. I can arrange a price for you. And she says, B'toch ami anochi yoshavet. I don't want to be distinguished. I don't want to have my head sticking out. My head is sticking out. So today I'll get something good. Tomorrow someone's going to cut my head off. It's better for me to simply be B'toch ami. I dwell within my people. And Elisha has to force her to admit that she has no children, therefore he gives her a child. He blesses her with a child. It's a basic human desire or instinct not to be distinguished, because if you're distinguished, you're asking to be judged. In our case, Lifnei Melech Machei Melachim. And so therefore, when there's a need to count them, so Torah says, I'll give you a remedy. As v'natnu ish kofer nafsho, each person gives a chatzi shekel, so that'll counteract the danger involved. On the other hand, we all know it's essential in the Torah, the value of the individual, how to be part of a mass is the lowest common denominator. From the very, very beginning, first of all, Chazal in Sanhedrin, the Mishnah in Sanhedrin talks about humanity. Lama nivra adam yechidi. Why was mankind created as a single individual? To tell you that from that one individual came many, many, many people, and they were all different. Ma partzufehem shonot, af deotehem shonot. Each person is a single individual, even though we're descended from Adam, but we're all different. Both in we can distinguish each other, we look different, but that's merely an expression of deotehem shonot, their personalities, their individuality, their values. Each one is a value unto himself. Or the next line in the Mishnah, one individual is a whole world. The valued individual is inherent in mankind. In the Jews, why is Abraham called Abraham Ha'ivri? Why is he called, in English, Abraham the Hebrew? You say maybe because he spoke Hebrew, but the Hebrew language is not mentioned until much later. The Hebrew language is called Ivrit because it was the language of the Ivrim. Why was Abraham called Ivri? Number of reasons given by Chazal. One of them is Afilu hu me'ever achad v'kol ha'olam kulo me'ever hasheni hu machriyat kulam. Avraham Avinu was a single individual against the whole world, and that's what made him the father of the Jewish people, because he wasn't part of the crowd. He wasn't part of the mass. He didn't flow with the flow. He was. If there was a scale, he was on one side, the rest of the world was on the other side. Pasuk in Yecheskel, Echad haya Avraham vayiresh et haaretz. Avraham was a single individual, And that's, he inherited Eretz Israel. The pshat is, and that's why he inherited Eretz Israel. It wasn't given to a people, one of the 70 peoples who happened to be the Jews. It was given to the one individual from several million individuals. But he was an echad. He was an individual. He didn't have any identity. Ivri is his ethnic identity. Ivri means he doesn't have an ethnic identity. He is himself. He is an Oved Hashem in the case of Avraham Avinu. And I could quote many, many, many more things. And that's what the pasuk is saying. Laseit et rosh. When you count them in order to distinguish them, in order to bring them out. But there's a tension between these two things. It's dangerous, it's comfortable, it's safer to be lost in the crowd, but it's ignoble to be lost in the crowd. A person has to have a distinguishing feature in order to make him into an individual, to make him something of value, to make him something which God can rely on. Echad haya Avraham, and therefore we have the history of the Jewish people and Eretz Israel. So I think that's why there are two minyanim in the Pasha, because in fact the Jews are really being counted now, not for what Rashi said. It isn't that God said, "Oh, a few months have gone by, let me go count them again." They're being counted now because we're about to fit them into a geographic structure called Machane Yisrael. And Machane Yisrael is the Merkava LaShechina. The Shechina in the Mishkan is surrounded by Yisrael. Vasuli Migdash in Parashat Truma, V'shachanti Betocham. The Machane is not a technical organization. It's Machane Shechina. It's the Machane Yisrael which surrounds Machane Shechina. It's the encampment of the place where Kvod Hashem, where God's presence will be found. And for that, it's not going to be found on one person. It's really one person will not be the basis for the Shechina. All the time, V'shachanti betocham, you need a tzibur, you need Am Yisrael, not an individual. You need a minyan. Ein davar shebikdusha pachot mi'asarat. In order to be makadesh Hashem ba'olam, you need 10 people, because 10 people are Klal Yisrael, are Anidah, v'nikdashti b'toch b'nei Yisrael. You have to have this super large group, the super valued group called Am Yisrael, which is formed by gathering the people and organizing them. But there's another counting done here. I don't think they were counted twice, actually. They weren't counted twice. It's the same count. They were counted one after the other, and then they sat down, they figured out the second Parsha. So how many go in this corner? How many go in the eastern corner? How many go in the western corner? It's the same count, but the counting has two bases. In the fact, they weren't counted to submerge them. They were counted to distinguish each one. Naso et rosh b'nei Yisrael, and the valued individuals combined together to make a super valued community. It's not that the mass is worth more than individuals. The individuals can form a greater mass. We're all familiar, Jewish history has taught us to be extremely, extremely suspicious of mass action, of 10,000 people here, or 100,000 there, or 400,000 people at a rally, at a political rally. We know what that leads to. The common denominator of mass human beings is animals, is animalistic. And we have a great deal of fear of what sometimes happens. 20,000 people, 50,000 people in the Kotel on Yontif, 200,000 people in Meron. Who knows how many tens of thousands of people at any good Hasidic wedding. It's a little scary, because what happens to the individual here? The Pasha says, Naso et rosh, make each person an individual, and then they'll belong, the Mishpechotam, the Beit Avotam, L'Shiftehem, and eventually to Am Yisrael. This, I think, is hinted at in what otherwise is totally inexplicable. God tells Moshe Rabbeinu to count, V'itchem yiyu, ish lamateh, ish l'rosh beit avotav. With you, with Aaron and Moshe, will be one person for each shevet. And what do? These are the Nesi'im. They're listed by name. Ve'ele shmot hanashim asher yamdu ittechem. LeRuven, Elitzur ben Shedayur, LeShimon, Shlumayel ben Suri Shaddai, LeYudah, Nachshon ben Aminadav, LeYisachar, Netanel ben Sura, etc. 12 individuals are chosen by name to be with you. What do? They don't help Moshe Rabbeinu count. They don't do anything. They're just there. Eile kiru'ei ha'eda. They've been called from the Eda. Nisi'ei matot avotam. Rashei alfei Yisrael. Heima. ויקח משה ואהרון את הנשים האלה. Moshe and Aaron took these people, אשר נקבו בשמות. They were called by name. What does it mean by name? They weren't 12 people, they were Nachshon, they were Yisachar, they were Eliav. Each one had a single name, a single individual, and they were there. They just stood there. Why are they there? The answer is that all 600,000 people are going to be counted by name. I don't know if I suspect that in the actual counting, they didn't mention the name of every single individual, even though the Pasuk says that they were, the next Pasuk Yudchet, ואת כל העדה הכירו באחד לחודש שני ויתאדו המשפחותן ואת אותם במספר שמות. They were counted. ויתיילדו על משפחותם לבית אבותם. They were counted by their families and their communal structure, בית אבותם, their חמולות, במספר שמות, according to the number of the names. I suspect they didn't actually count each name, but there were 12 people from each shevet who had been called by God by their names, who just stood next to them. The point is that the counting should be, in theory at least, and maybe even reality. They didn't count 6,000 people. They counted Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun, Binyamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Yankel, Shmuel, Beryl, Shmuel. They counted each person by their name because each person is an individual. The 12 Rashei HaShevatim, Kru'ei HaEdah, Asher Nikvu B'Shemot, God called them by name. He wanted these people. What does it mean? He wanted each person because of his special qualities. And therefore the whole counting is, each person is counted because of his special qualities. And the final goal is that, yes, we're going to make Am Yisrael. We're going to make something which is greater than the individual. Something which has it's super generational and ultra time. It's Knesset Yisrael for all times. But it's composed out of 600,000 individuals. The tension between the power of the mass and the value of the single individual is, I wouldn't say resolved, but is maintained in the Torah by saying, take each individual out of the mass and then combine them together, lefi mishpachto, lefi beit avotav, according to his family, according to his section group, according to his tribal group, and eventually you have a Knesset Yisrael, you have a encampment of the Jews around the Mishkan, which is one machaneh, one Mishkan, one Shechina, one Am Yisrael, but it's composed of the values of each and every individual, and that is the lesson which takes many, many, many psukim, 60, 70, 80 psukim, of counting people by their names and by their individuals, and then the Leviim and the Bnei Aaron, because every individual has a value that's independent of the person next to him. And if one of them is missing, then the whole machaneh won't be the same machaneh. It makes a difference whether there are 600,000, 3,050, 550 Jews or 549 Jews. It's not a lot of people. It's the combination of each and every mispar shemot. Every person has a separate thing to contribute, and that's a contribution to the value of the totality of Klal Yisrael. Thank you.